After 19 months of Brexit negotiations, there's finally a deal with the EU. Now all the British Prime Minister has to do is convince her own parliament. But can she? I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is Britain's Brexit deal. The EU says take it or leave it. Theresa May says back me or we're back to square one. But will those powerful words be enough to persuade the British Parliament to get on board? Right now, there's serious opposition across the board. Even many within the Prime Minister's own Conservative Party think her deal is a bad one. But can Theresa May change their minds? She doesn't have much time. Parliament is set to vote before the end of December, and winning the vote in the House of Commons will be a tall order. Can she beat the odds? And if not, what will it mean for her future and the future of Brexit? Haider Abbasi reports.
Negotiations between Britain and the European Union haven't been easy. They've been so rough that two of the UK's Brexit secretaries have thrown in the towel. But after nearly 20 months of talks, EU member states have agreed to a deal that will see the UK leave the bloc. And the vote in Brussels took less than an hour.
There were those who said that reaching a Brexit agreement that worked for both sides was an impossible task. From the start, I rejected that counsel of despair and set about negotiating a deal that worked for the UK and the EU.
But it's not over for Theresa May. The EU's accepted the agreement, but Britain's Parliament hasn't. And it seems the UK's Prime Minister will struggle to sell it to the House of Commons.
I don't believe currently, given everything that is happening, that she will get support for that. I know she's going over the heads of people and she's doing that in Northern Ireland as well. But as far as I can see in Parliament, she does not have support for this deal.
It's not just the main opposition Labour Party that opposes her deal, but also some of May's fellow Conservatives. At least 80 members of her party say they'll vote against it. So why is May's withdrawal deal such a hard sell? Those who want to stay in the European Union, known as Remainers, say her plan is just a diluted version of Britain's current membership, with continued access to the single market and customs union. And for hardline Brexiteers, the agreement's not actually Brexit. The UK will still have to follow EU rules that it won't get to create. So what happens if Parliament rejects May's deal? There are several possibilities. Another negotiation, a no-deal Brexit, a general election, or Britain's vote again on whether to leave the EU. But as far as Europe's concerned, there won't be another agreement.
I'm totally convinced that this is the only deal possible. Those who do think, by rejecting the deal, that they would have a better deal, will be disappointed in the first seconds after the rejection of this deal.
Britain's Parliament is likely to vote on the agreement next month. But deal or no deal, according to EU laws, Britain will be out of the bloc on March 29th. So what will that look like? And will Theresa May still be Prime Minister? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Lee Jones. He's an Associate Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University. In Strasbourg, we have Julie Girling. She's a member of the European Parliament for South West England and Gibraltar. And Helen Drake. She's a Professor of European Studies at Loughborough University, London. I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Let me start with you, Lee Jones. As we look at what's happening with Brexit, as we reach the end of November 2018, has this government made an entire mess of Brexit?
Well, undoubtedly it has made a real botch job, which is not surprising when you consider that it's basically a Remainer government implementing the decision to leave. The entire British political class is not behind Brexit, is implementing only reluctantly, and has tried to minimise any disruption to the status quo, and so you end up with essentially Brexit in name only.
Julie Girling, the Europeans are united. They're basically saying it's this or nothing. This is the deal. You take it or leave it. Is that the best way to approach it? And do they have every right to do so?
No, I think if you fail to negotiate for 2.5 years and then suddenly come up with something at the end and say, this is it, take it or leave it, then that's not really an acceptable way to proceed. So I agree with Lee Jones on this one, probably for different reasons, but I think we're in the same place here, that this is unrealistic, unreasonable, and doesn't give really either side what they want. So I can't imagine what the government are thinking about really pushing this agenda. It's crazy.
But I mean, ultimately, I mean, and pardon the sort of crude analogy, but the Europeans are saying, well, you don't get to break up with me, but still want to share the same bed, right? If you want to go, you go, but you don't get to keep all the nice things you had beforehand. And that's where they are right now, isn't it?
Well, that's been the situation. It's not where they are right now. That's been the situation from the beginning. It was very clear that this was going to be extremely difficult. You're leaving 27, and if you feel that you can negotiate and give the 27 something that they really want, and therefore get what you want in return, fine, put it on the table. I don't think that's been done, and we're in the position now where, I mean, some of us, like me, would say, well, we were always going to end up here. I'm just astonished that we didn't end up here 2 years ago. I mean, I could have written this script 24 months ago, and that's the bit where I feel very aggrieved, because it gives absolutely no room for improving this deal at all. It is, as you say, take it or leave it, and neither side of this argument, either me as a strong Remainer or Mr. Jones as a strong Leaver, is happy with that.
Okay, Helen Drake, the other two guests are not very happy about where we are. They're both quite depressed about where we are right now. Do you share their pessimism?
Yeah, probably for different reasons again. It was clear right from the outset, and we now have evidence to show that the campaigns themselves around the referendum back in 2016 were flawed for all sorts of different reasons, in particular on the Leave side, but also on the Remain side, in terms of not making a terribly good fist of it, not making a very good or strong case for staying in the European Union. So right from the beginning, right from before the referendum, things were clearly not going to take a sort of a track that we might think of as logical and so on. And then moving forward, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, when she became Prime Minister after that summer of sort of crazy shuffling and so on, she made it very clear. She had red lines that, you know, no customs union, no single market, and so on. And from that moment on, it was always going to be extremely difficult. And then and then Article 50 was triggered, well, quite early on, although some say it was triggered too soon, some say it was triggered too late. That was a judgment call. Probably, that it was made for internal, in particular, Tory party politics. And so that's why we are where we are now. The clock has been ticking ever since. The EU was negotiated in the way it always was going to negotiate. I don't really know why anyone's surprised about that. The whole sort of, the whole 2.5 years, in a way, has followed a trajectory that I don't really think we should be surprised about. The withdrawal agreement itself, even that, it's not that surprising. Right. It doesn't really please anyone, but nor is it a shoddy document in its own terms.
Lee Jones, why hasn't Theresa May been able to convince her friends that they should support her?
Well, as people have been saying already, it's a deal that satisfies absolutely no one. It's not really a clean break from the European Union, so it doesn't satisfy people who supported Leave, but obviously it's not as good as remaining in the European Union, as any deal leaving the European Union would be less than you would get as a member, so that's not surprising either. So it's a deal that really satisfies nobody. It's an attempt to compromise between the two sides and bring the two sides together, and there is some need to try to unite the country, and it is terribly divided, but this deal doesn't do that. It won't convince people, because at the heart of it, large parts of UK territory are essentially going to be remaining within the European Union without any British input into that governance. So it really sacrifices British sovereignty on an ongoing basis. Some people would say it's even worse than the European Union, because you can't get out of the backstop without their agreement. Right. At least with Article 50, you could trigger it and walk away.
But certainly, Lee, I mean, and I was just recently in Northern Ireland, things like the Troubles might cook up again. I mean, this is one of the major worries if there's a hard border, for example, right? And that's one of the reasons why the DUP is having this fascinating relationship with May at the moment. Didn't they think about all this stuff at the beginning? This is the point, right? Of course you knew Northern Ireland was going to be an issue. Suddenly it seems as if, oh, they went, oh, my God, what's going to happen with Northern Ireland? And might there be trouble again if we put a border here? Were they naive and just frankly very stupid a couple years ago when they pushed ahead?
No, not at all. I mean, the Irish issue came up during the referendum campaign and, you know, didn't sway the argument. And so this was in people's minds from the very beginning. And both sides wanted to avoid a hard border, but I feel like the European Union has used the Irish border issue in order to try to keep the UK aligned as closely as possible to the European Union, in particular to prevent any socialist policies and anything that would allow us to use state aid or anything more competitive. So I feel it's been manipulated. I think there are technological solutions eventually that will allow us to have a frictionless border in the same way that, for example, Switzerland is used. And I think the talk of renewed troubles or violence is really just a shroud waving to try to defeat Brexit. So I think there are, you know, pragmatic solutions, but they've been rejected consistently on the EU side, and that's why we end up with this backstop agreement that the UK cannot exit unilaterally without the EU agreeing. So this has been the issue all along, without Britain essentially accepting the responsibility for its sovereignty over Northern Ireland and saying, well, we will manage the border how we see fit. That has allowed the European Union to constantly reject all of the pragmatic ideas that have been put forward by the UK government. So and we end up with a really shoddy backstop agreement.
So let's ask Helen. Helen, is that how you see it, that the Europeans have been the spoilers here? They haven't come to the party. It's not the UK's problem. It's not the UK's, I guess, lack of trying.
There is some truth in what the previous speaker just said, but I also would really take issue with, first of all, it may well be true. It's quite a while back now. It may well be true that Ireland and Northern Ireland and the Irish border was mentioned in the campaign, but I can assure you it certainly wasn't at the forefront. Nor even in the background. And one of the things that the withdrawal agreement has respected, if you like, is the sort of the red lines that Theresa May laid down at the front, and in particular the sorts of things that she's been saying most recently in her PR campaign at the moment around freedom of movement. I mean, the Prime Minister is sort of setting up some quite unpleasant language around the free movement of Europeans, talking about jumping the queue and so on. And immigration, and in particular immigration from Europe, was much more to the forefront than Ireland. So that I'd just like to say that. Can I say something else? Well,
yeah, sure. And for the record, just before you continue, for the record, having covered that 2 years ago, one of the central campaign issues was that 75 million Turks were on the verge of entering the UK unless you vote for Brexit. That's something, you know, from Istanbul that we remember here. Go ahead, Helen.
In fact, on that, I was asked to go and talk to a group of elderly people living in a home just outside when I was still working on the Midlands campus. I'm on the London campus now. And that was one of the main things that those elderly people told me they were scared about, because, as you know, some on the Leave campaign side had indeed given the impression that, and it's true that Turkey, as you know, was a candidate member, but that's right, they were very worried about that. Going back to the sort of the EU, I think, I mean, there's some truth in the fact that on the side of the EU, the Irish border and the question of and that question has been, it's been a key issue. But I'm rather reluctant to use the sort of words, I'm sorry, that Lee has, because the European Union has lots of incentives to stay united, and Europe is one of the EU 27. And again, to go back to your question, it was always going to be clear. It was quite clear from the outset that the EU 27 would stick to the integrity of the single market. Whether or not they are, yes, to an extent, that's an exaggerated position, and that's a choice that they're making. But it's not surprising that the EU have made that choice. And I think to sort of ascribe to that choice political intentions to withhold the freedom that Brexit is supposed to bring, I think that's going a bit too far.
Okay, yeah, I mean, for Lee, it's sovereignty. For you, Helen, you don't see it that way. Julie, in the European capitals and within the corridors of power, they'd be following the news and they'd be following the chaos within Parliament over the past few weeks and months. They know it's quite likely that she's not going to get this passed through Parliament. They're saying take it or leave it, and they know that she might not get the support that she needs. or she's most likely not to get the support that she needs. So what are they actually planning for?
Well, that's a really good question, because I agree with your analysis. And of course, Europe, in using that word broadly, has got to think about what it's going to do if that doesn't go through, because the only track at the moment is the cliff edge. So exiting with no deal at all, which is, I agree, not in anyone's interest, and that's the sort of bogeyman that's being held up by the government to try and force British parliamentarians into voting. So I think in, as you call it, the corridors of power here in Brussels, those preparations are well underway. They have been for some months. It's very clear that there will be in place. For example, the Netherlands have taken on over 1,000 new customs people to make sure that their border runs as smoothly as it can do, with its almost hourly shipments on roll off to the UK through Rotterdam. Those preparations continue. Politically, what are they doing? Well, politically, they've been very clear. They've accepted this deal, and all they can do now is hope that London can get it through Westminster. But they've been very clear that they're not going to interfere in that process. Right. Angela Merkel said yesterday, this is now, down to London to do it. Of course, the issue of Ireland, which you've just been discussing, is an interesting one, because I suspect the Irish will not just sit back. It was very clear right from the beginning that the EU27, and they said clearly, we will take the interests of Ireland top of our list, front of our minds, because they are a member state that are remaining, and I suspect that there will be a great deal of work going on between the 26 plus and Ireland to see that we can open as smoothly as we can.
Lee, for a lot of people, all of this has just, I guess, further justified the need 2 years on, or more than 2 years on, for a new vote. What they call the people's vote. Would you ever support that, Lee?
No, I think it would be absolutely disastrous for British democracy to have a second referendum, the clear intention of which is to overturn a democratic vote a couple of years ago. The issue at hand now is really about consent, the principle of consent in Britain. Can the people instruct their political establishment to do what they want it to do? Or can the political establishment prevaricate, oppose, quarrel, and through sheer incompetence and reluctance, fail to implement those wishes, and then bounce back to the people and say, well, we can't really be bothered to implement your instructions, or we can only implement them in a completely botched way. Right. Can you please change your mind and give us a different instruction?
Lee,
that would be terminal for British democracy.
Certainly. At what point have they botched it to such an extent that perhaps the only way is to say, mea culpa, maybe we have to put it to another vote, maybe we gave you the wrong information 2 years ago, maybe we need a fresh start? Isn't that a case for democracy as well, Lee?
The political establishment would be delighted to do that, because for them, this is a complete nightmare. They never wanted the people to give them this instruction, and they're really reluctant to implement it. And so they would love to say, oh, Parliament is paralysed, we can't do what you told us to do, can you please tell us to do something different? And that would be an absolute inflection point for British democracy, where essentially the elite says, you can only tell us to do what we will accept to do. And that would be absolutely disastrous for British democracy. So I don't support the idea of a second referendum, but it's quite possible that a second referendum will be called, precisely because the British political elite on both sides of the aisle really don't want to leave the European Union.
Helen Drake, second referendum?
Well, there's quite a lot to say there, isn't there? Yeah, first of all then, it would be, so there are lots of problems with the idea of a second referendum. One is, if there were a second referendum, if there were to be, for whatever reason, because parliamentary processes failed, let's say, to be a second referendum, a first point I'd like to say is that it would be extremely important not to couch that in the sort of terms that my colleague just has, in that everybody would have to be very clear that it wasn't in order to get a different outcome. It wouldn't be to reverse leave and have remain. It would be more of a genuine open vote on the basis of what's gone on in the last 2.5 years.
But that was a genuine open vote 2 years ago, right, Helen?
Well, we can take issue. There are issues around the wording of the vote, and there are issues, as I alluded to earlier, about the nature of the campaigns. But the point I'm trying to say is that Lee's right to say that the idea of a second referendum, in order to overturn the result of the first one, would, in today's politics, in British and in particular English politics, be very, very risky. However we want to couch it in a theoretical term. But another thing is that procedurally, there really isn't the time, and I don't think in order to propose, authorize, organize, hold, and so on a second referendum before the clock. But no, but this is important, because that to rush a second referendum would be problematic. I think under those conditions, if somehow a second referendum emerges out of this mess as the path that's going to be taken, then Article 50 would somehow, there'd have to be some sort of extension. And whether the EU would want that or not, I don't know. There's a lot more I could say. So whether or not I've personally right to vote again, that's not the issue. It would be very high risk.
I'm having to ask for extra time here. I want to give Julie the final word here. Julie, we're going to lose your window in less than a minute, so if you could keep your answer very brief, I'd appreciate that. Go ahead, Julie.
First of all, I'd just like to condemn the language that Lee's using, overturn, disastrous. No, it's a perfectly legitimate thing. If a first referendum was a good idea, then a second referendum is just as good an idea. In fact, it's an opportunity to restore people's faith in the democratic process, because if he thinks there is one now that he's preserving by not having a second referendum, he needs to get out more, because all I hear is people are completely fed up with Westminster and its processes. And secondly, just to reply to Helen, the House of Lords report last week suggested that we could have a second vote by the 1st of May. It would require the European Union to extend Article 50 for 2 months. I'm absolutely confident that that can be done. They've said it can be done in order to have a second referendum. Not for the government to faff around more. No, they won't extend. But if it's specifically to have a second referendum, then they will.
Okay, I've got to wrap. Julie, Lee and Helen, listen, it's been a pleasure having you all on the Newsmakers. We will certainly be doing more Brexit coverage before the end of March next year, and we hope to have you all back on the show very soon. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the Newsmakers, victims or perpetrators? European children caught up in Daesh's reign of terror are now stranded in Syria. Should they be allowed to go home, or do they pose a risk? And as the UN marks its International Day to eliminate violence against women, TRT World launches a campaign called Women of War. We speak to some of those trying to make a difference to people impacted by conflict. Daesh has been one of the most brutal terror groups in modern times. They've murdered, raped and mutilated thousands of innocent people. And in some cases, they've used children to do it. But the group has lost almost all of its territory. And those under the age of 18 who came from Europe or were born to Daesh's European fighters are now stranded. Should they be allowed to return home? Do they pose too much of a risk? Or does the EU have a duty of care to its minors? That debate in a moment. But first, this report by Natalie Perhernan.
Since 2012, about 5,000 European men, women and children travelled to Iraq and Syria, joining what was then Daesh's self-proclaimed Caliphate. More children were born there. As Daesh's hold on territory shrunk and its fighters were killed or captured, wives and children of foreign fighters were moved into camps. Now, many of them want to return home. It's a double-edged dilemma for European authorities. How do you balance the interests of national security with the welfare of some of your youngest citizens? Particularly when older children may have taken part in military training, and when many of these children have been brought up with Daesh ideology. Dutch authorities can class children as young as 9 years old as foreign fighters. In Belgium, it's from the age of 12. It's estimated about 460 French children, 290 Germans, 140 Belgians, and 80 Dutch boys and girls are still in Iraq and Syria. Many of these children are traumatized. bringing them back into the fold of mainstream European society won't be an easy task. They'll need specialised welfare and rehabilitation. It's up to each country to decide how and whether they should bring these children back to their soil. But if these children are at further risk of radicalisation by staying where they are now, is the duty to repatriate a higher priority? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Let's debate this with our panel. In London, we have Gina Vale, who's a research fellow at King's College, London's International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation, specialising in minors affiliated with Daesh. And we also have Ben Harris-Quinney, who's the chairman of the conservative think tank, the Bow Group. I thank you both for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Ben, let me start with you. There's a conundrum for European countries. They don't know what to do with those deemed kids under the age of 18 who are European citizens who were involved with ISIS or Daesh. Should there be a conundrum, or should they just take them back and try and fix them and try and reintegrate them into society?
No, I think it's a very complex issue, as you say. You've got two kinds of minors that may have been involved in ISIS. Those that went out of their own volition to join up with ISIS, and those that were taken out by their parents. I think when it comes to those that went out of their own volition, my view is the same as an adult who went out there, that the United Kingdom should be actively seeking to prevent their re-entry into the UK. For those that went out under their parents' guidance, I think that is a slightly different case. Some of them, in fact, I understand many hundreds were actually born in ISIS territory. And so there's a question of where their citizenship rests, whether their citizenship rests in their country of birth or whether it is tied to their parentage, which of course brings the United Kingdom into the question. And my feeling is that those people should be able to apply, at least for UK citizenship, and be considered and be assessed by the security services, but also be considered to be allowed back into the United Kingdom, as really they were innocents in the process.
So Gina, Ben's making a distinction here. He's saying there's two types of kids you're dealing with. Do you make that distinction as well? And is Ben looking at it in the correct way?
From the research I and my organisation have done, we see that it's useful to subcategorize minors. So age group is one way that we can do this, and this is in line with the circumstances of them joining the group, as well as the roles that they have undertaken. So as Ben has said, there is a difference between those who joined willingly and those that were accompanied with their parents. For us, we see this from the point of view of looking at reports of minors who have travelled. The minimum age of those going unaccompanied and travelling on their own without a parent or a guardian is about 15. So we see teenagers as a separate category and the minors under that. As Ben also mentioned, we have another category of infants, those that have been born inside Islamic State territory. And my colleagues and I have counted about 730, and that's just from available data on this. It's very difficult to try and create policies on something which is such an individualized phenomenon. We cannot use broad brush responses for a 4-year-old the same as we can for a 16-year-old. And this is where we need to understand the individual circumstances surrounding minors and adults, exactly the same, how and why they have joined the group, what their roles were within that group, and then also the circumstances of their dissociation, whether, again, that was voluntary or whether that was through interception of potentially Iraqi forces or others. So again, there is nuance needed across these different stages.
Yeah, it is complicated. Let's bring in Tasneem Akunji, who joins us now from London. He's a lawyer working in the field of terrorism. So Tasneem, we heard from the other two saying, well, you have to kind of pass this out and separate it out. There's a difference between, as we heard, a 4-year-old who was just sort of born in Raqqa during the height of all this trouble to European parents, and somebody who might be 16 and might have used a weapon, might have killed people on behalf of Daesh and might actually be brainwashed. Do you see it in the same way?
Well, if the question is, do we differentiate between children and create a special category, for some children as opposed to others, and by that creation of a subcategory, do we deny some children help and their rights? Then I don't see a distinction between children. At the end of the day, the law in the UK anyway is that until you're a certain age you can't vote, and anyone under that age you sort of can, and there's a broad brush approach to that because we categorize children as a generic special category. So the idea that we will say, well, we have one policy for babies, but we'll have another policy for 14-year-olds is an invention that doesn't exist really in the law in any other sphere. So it's a special category once again for people who are in a difficult situation.
Okay, so Ben, you have to take them both back, whether you like it or not, whether it was a 16-year-old who might have even beheaded someone and a 4-year-old who's not committed any crime. Both are children, and if they are European citizens, you bring them in and you try and fix it, just like, I don't know, kids with a drug problem who happen to be your citizens. You try and fix it. What do you think?
Well, I think that's not accurate in three ways. The first way is that in the United Kingdom, if a minor commits an extremely serious crime, that of a premeditated murder or some forms of child abuse, then often they are tried as an adult, despite being underage. The case that springs to mind is the James Bulger case, but there have been many where those under the age of 18 have not had their criminal records cleared at 18 due to the severity of their crimes. And I think beheading people in ISIS territory falls under that most serious category. The second is that once these people have left the United Kingdom and there is some debate over whether they should be allowed back in, there are two elements that come into play. One is an assessment by the Home Office as to whether these people should be granted access to the United Kingdom as migrants or asylum seekers, and one is an assessment by the security services as to whether these people pose a threat to other citizens in the United Kingdom. So I think all of those three tests need to be met before letting someone back into the UK. And so there is a bespoke method in that sense for assessing this, because whenever it comes to this level of severity, you know, the security services will be assessing each individual on a very specific and individual basis. And I think that's right, and I think that is what needs to happen when it falls under the category of these most severe crimes.
Tasneem Akunji, you need a customized solution to a customized problem. You need the bespoke solution with people looking at it closely. What do you think?
Well, I roundly reject what Ben says, in that what he suggests, therefore, is that the UK government leaves some people stateless, children who are not citizens of any particular place, because of the difficulty around assessing them or assessing that they've committed a criminal act. And if they are British citizens, then they ought to be tried under British justice, not left out in the field as stateless individuals. And that's what troubles me the most, the idea that we don't take responsibility for the issue of our own creation. So quite rightly, as Ben has said, that there are elements within the law which allow for blocking people coming into the UK who are not UK citizens on the basis that they are a threat to national security or the public good. And that's right and proper. They are other states' citizens, and we don't want other people's problems. But by the same fork, we can't then simply pass on our citizens, who are our responsibility, and force other people to take on the responsibility of them when they are probably the least equipped people to do so.
Gina, are both men right here?
I would agree in terms of needing to repatriate minors. First and foremost, we need to respond to this in adherence to international human rights law. We cannot leave stateless children stateless. If we look at the time period of Al-Qaeda in Iraq from about 2004 to 2009, the Iraqi government have actually stated that about 520 children were born stateless from that period. And they had about a quarter of the recorded fighters that we can account for at the moment, and that's just based on available data. So we're facing potential thousands of stateless minors, and this may be on account of unofficial marriage certificates or birth certificates that are not recognized by states. If we then exacerbate this issue by rejecting the acceptance of our own nationals, whether those be adults or minors, back into our own countries, then we are actually adding to the burden of the Iraqi and potentially the Syrian judicial and detention services, as well as rehabilitation support services that are available or potentially not available in these countries. And the only people that we are hurting in this process are ourselves and those children. If we continue down this route of rejecting or not, as we said, cleaning up the mess that we have created, then we're going to just end up continuing a cycle of violence that has international ramifications.
Right. Ben, let me ask you about the French. The French say no adult fighters, no women considered wives of fighters, but children, yes, we'll bring them in and we'll sort them out. Do the French have the capability to de-radicalize, to reintegrate these kids? And again, across that vast range of the almost 18-year-olds to almost toddlers or infants?
Well, I think that the French have all of the same problems and arguably more problems than other European countries when it comes to radicalization. Of course, we're aware of the many terrorist atrocities that have occurred in France. But I think that something has been skipped over in terms of the assumption that these people are automatically British citizens. If they have gone to join another nation, much in the same way that if I applied for US citizenship, for example, and took US citizenship, the United Kingdom would not necessarily have to readmit me as a UK citizen. And there's also the question that has been raised of those people that were born in ISIS territory. They are not necessarily British citizens.
Okay, but let's say, for instance, sorry to interrupt you, let's say, for instance, you were 9 years old and your parents took you to Raqqa. You didn't really have much of a choice in that, did you?
No, well, that's exactly what I said at the beginning in terms of there must be differentiation between those that have gone out there of their own volition to fight and those that have been taken out there by their parents. I think all have to be considered by security services and the immigration authorities. But in those cases where someone has been taken along by their parents, not necessarily against their will, but without their will, then I think there is a reasonable case to be made that they should be readmitted into the United Kingdom, but certainly should be under the review of both the Home Office in terms of immigration and the security services in terms of any threat they pose, because the most important thing is the first duty of government, and of course the first duty of the security services is to ensure the safety of the majority of British citizens. And we can't be impeding the safety of the majority of British citizens for these minority cases of those people that have been either born in ISIS territory or have gone out of their own volition to fight for ISIS.
Tasneem Akunji, extending that question that I asked Ben, do you think the British have the capability of reintegrating and rehabilitating a lot of these kids of varying experiences? Some of them been through hell, some of them might have done terrible things.
So one of the things I want to take you up on is the idea that these children had went and gone to another state where they've taken up statehood. Well, if they've gone to ISIS or Al-Qaeda controlled territory, neither ISIS nor Al-Qaeda were ever considered a legitimate state by any other nation. I don't understand where he gets the idea that these people have citizenship somewhere else. Where is that other place that they have citizenship in, unless he's suggesting it's Syria somehow through ISIS or Al-Qaeda fished them. So it's a bit of a nonsense argument, frankly. Does the UK have the ability to rehabilitate people? I would imagine that these children have extended families, the vast majority of whom would have no sympathy whatsoever with the causes that are purported that these children had taken up abroad. So I would imagine that their families and extended families, much of whom pick up the burden of these children anyway in a de facto situation with how the UK deals with it currently, and they're the ones that give them love and affection and reintegrate them into society. There's a very, very small minority of people who have gone out to Syria for a particularly unpleasant activity or cause, and most of the family members of those individuals, the vast majority, will be very much against them. So I don't see why certain people are thinking that the state is going to pick up the burden of rehabilitating kids. The state is particularly bad at rehabilitating children, even normal children outside of this extreme context. But families are there for these kids in most cases, and so the burden falls on them, and usually they'll achieve that quite well. Children are very resilient to reorientation.
Okay, Ben, Gina, and Tasneem, I've got to move on, but listen, it's a fascinating topic. There's no clear answers, and it is a complicated issue here. Everybody's trying to figure out what to do after, especially, Daesh lost most of its territory, and I think it's been fascinating talking to all of you. Hope to have you all back on the Newsmakers again in the not-too-distant future. Thanks again. As of this moment, at least a third of the world's countries are involved in some form of conflict. The biggest victims are always civilians, and in war zones, women will often be specifically targeted. In Liberia, more than 40,000 women were victims of sexual violence during its first civil war. In Rwanda, at least 250,000 were raped and abused in just 1 year. The UN has designated rape as a weapon of war, but its widespread use continues to wreak havoc on communities. Well, TRT World Citizen, the philanthropic arm of the network, has launched a campaign to raise awareness of this issue. It's called Women of War. Take a look.
Sexual violence has been a consistent feature of the conflict.
Conflict-related violence took a particularly heavy toll on women and children.
As a lesser crime and a problem too difficult or too uncomfortable for societies to address. This is rape used as a weapon to achieve military or political goals.
Nothing could have prepared me for the extent and depth of the suffering I saw.
Everything I do is an act of survival for myself, for the group of people that I work with. It's time for us to make real these commitments about equality. You know your issues, you know your priorities, stand up, step out, and work for your own peace.
Well, let's go to our panel in Sarajevo. I'm joined by Selma Haji Halilovic. She's an activist and campaign manager of Fondatia Cure. And in Mogadishu, we have Dr. Mohammed. She's the Chief Executive Officer at the Dr. Hawa Abdi Foundation, which cares for thousands of Somalis. I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Selma, let me begin with you. Tell me why, perhaps, over the generations and the decades, the specific impact of war on women hasn't been focused on. People have just sort of lumped everything together.
Thank you for such an easy question. I wish that there was an easy answer to that question. I wish that we are learning about war in schools and from books, but unfortunately we are not. And yet again, over and over, a generation after generation is suffering the same consequences of war. And usually it is the women who are the biggest victims, but also the strongest survivors. Unfortunately, even in the times of peace, women are not involved in a conflict solution finding, and even today, 20 years after the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we are still hearing in the mainstream media only about victims. Right. Me as an activist and as a woman who fights for the rights of women, I want to speak about the survivors, and I want to speak on their behalf right now.
Right. Dr. Mohammed, obviously different context in Somalia, but do you find similarities with what we're hearing from Selma, that perhaps the focus hasn't been on women and it should be?
I haven't heard much, but I will say there's a lot of similarity because the issues that facing a woman around the world is the same, especially in the war zones. So they are the victims and they are the weapon on the war. So the rape and everything happening is on the woman. So, and she's the front line, she's the one who's gonna suffer, she's the one who's gonna lose her son, her husband, or her brother. So it's not only the rape happening on her body and abuse, also the trauma that involved in the war.
Yeah, Selma, I remember when I visited the Balkans, especially when I spoke to those who were the widows of men who were killed in Srebrenica and so on. You had, usually the men in the family were killed, and it was up to the women who were now left with the task of not only rebuilding the family, but rebuilding the society. Have they received the help that they should be receiving?
Thank you so much for raising this question, because it is absolutely one of the questions that nobody really wants to talk about. And I'm so pleased to have among my friends women survivors of genocide who returned to their place of origin and who are trying to rebuild their societies. I am talking about the areas around Srebrenica where the biggest genocide after the Second World War took place, where today the majority of the returnees are actually women. We are talking about women-led households. We are talking about women who are trying to struggle, not only the fact that they have become the mere bearers of their families, that they had to find strength to come back home and to continue with their lives, but also women who are today struggling to put their kids into school, to pay for education, to have the right to health insurance, to be educated, even to have the right on cultural events in their local communities. Unfortunately, what you know about Bosnia and Herzegovina, allow me to say this, you know about the terrible things that happened in our war. And maybe you know a little bit about the beauties of Sarajevo and Mostar, one of the most famous cities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but you know very little about the little communities where people have bridged the differences, have decided that they want to continue to live together, and they're doing amazing things.
Deka Mohammed, let me ask you a question about the Horn of Africa and how, from my perspective as a journalist, women were used in terms of propaganda for different sides. So, for example, when it came to the Islamic courts and then Al-Shabaab, when we were covering the story, we heard of the subjugation of women under those groups that came with a very harsh version of Islam and their own kind of military domination. On the other hand, when there was an Ethiopian invasion, the Ethiopians and their backers were saying, we're going to be going there to liberate the women. And invariably, both sides end up killing civilians, killing women, and so forth. Tell me what this means as a woman in the Horn of Africa, as a woman in Somalia, that you're always used as an excuse for people's violence.
Oh, thank you for asking. It's a very important question. And the confusion that people have, as a Somali, we are a Muslim, we're very proud African Muslim, and all in Horn of Africa. African women are very strong women and the leader for their home. But no matter how hard they work and how they are part of educators, the breadwinners, the families, the leaders, they were not acknowledged, their role and their importance in the family. And in Somalia, before Islamic court or before Al-Shabaab came, Somali women were independent and hardworking and being proud to be African plus Muslim. And we're in our Islamic tradition and respect. But when the Islamic court came or Al-Shabaab came, everything fall apart. You know, it get worse. The rape was terrible. You know, the child marriage that happened in 1413 came out. Women couldn't go outside. We couldn't wear our normal, beautiful, colorful dresses like Africans. It's very complicated. But Ethiopian calling us, we're gonna liberate, they are the one who brought more rape than during the Islamic court or Al-Shabaab. So it was very confusing. You came, you brought your soldiers, you want to, give us the freedom and liberty you're talking about, but the rape increased, the killing get more worse. We get burned from both sides, and none of them, not for the Islamists, not for the other groups of Ethiopian or the government, were not thinking the issues and respect and rule and rights of a woman. None of them were in the first place in agenda. So it's very sad to. We can take over as African women, as a Muslim woman. We should take our issues in our hand. We don't have to wait being discussed in a table and be in a menu. We need to be in a table and talk about our issues. I need to talk my rights and say, no, I wouldn't accept. I want to be, you cannot discuss about me and make some decision without me. So if you're doing decision without me, you're against me. So that's how I feel we should speak out.
So Salma, is that fundamentally what is most necessary? More women at the table to talk about their experiences and to be in leadership positions?
Absolutely, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I reject to be an object. I reject to be an object of war. I reject to be an object of political struggles, of political elite over my body and over my country. We have women from Bosnia and Herzegovina. We witnessed the fact that at the Dayton Peace Agreement, discussions for the Dayton Peace Agreement, women were not present. And we believe that the problems that we are facing in our lives today is the consequence of that. That women have not been present at the negotiation table and our voices have not been heard. We are struggling with things that should be parts of our daily realities, like schools, like transportation, like health issues. Unfortunately, our male leaders did not find interesting or did not find important to discuss about those things at the Dayton Peace Agreement. We activists, we believe in two things. First of all, that justice means different things for different people. There is one justice for me, while there is another justice for a survivor of war violence. We have an initiative, regional initiative, that is called the Women's Court, that is trying to bring women together, women of different nationalities, different religious backgrounds, social, economic background, together, and we discuss the violence that we survived. And I'm emphasizing survival. We are the survivors. And for us, justice is something different than the justice that the others want to impose on us. That's one thing. As a citizen of the world, and as a women's rights activist, as a social justice activist, as somebody who's been at a very young age through a war, I have a responsibility for my daughter, also for the other generations. I have to speak up, not only in the name of my fellow sisters, survivors, activists, but also in the name of all women around the world. We need to be included in the peace negotiation processes. If women's voices are not heard, the new peace negotiation processes will not bring sustainable peace in the future. We will have something that might satisfy some political desires, but the society in general will still suffer. And we need to be included. And this is my pledge. Really, women have to take part fully, 100% active in all peace negotiation process taking place right now.
Strong point, and unfortunately I'm going to have to leave it at that because I have to move on. But the two of you are already two of my favorite guests on the Newsmakers. So when we talk about the Balkans again, or we talk about Somalia, or anything interrelated, I'd love to have you both back on the program. Salma Haji Halilovic and Deqa Mohammed, thank you very much for joining us. All the best.
Thank you.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, they're the most powerful force in Syria's last rebel-held area. But after being accused of an assassination and a chemical attack, is Hayat Tahrir Sham undermining the opposition to Assad? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.